Welcome once again to the DRH show. Today I'm joined by the founder of Tabula Rasa Retreat, Alvaro de Ferranti. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Dennis.
Great to have you here, Alvaro. And I'm sure you have an interesting background which led you to founding Tabula Rasa. So if you could just paint us a picture of your trajectory in life and how you ended up doing what you're doing.
Right, okay. So where to start? So I grew up in Portugal in the early 70s. So we moved to Portugal from the UK in 1973. And we lived just on the outskirts of Lisbon, overlooking the River Tagus, which is a fabulous spot, looking out to the estuary and to the sea. And when the revolution happened on the 25th of April, 1974, this lovely hill that we used to live on gradually got populated with people from the ex-colonies, namely Cape Verde, Mozambique, Angola. And I could say I had a very, very colorful childhood. I forged many friendships, many that I still have today. What happened, as we're talking about the trajectory from what seemed to be an extremely happy childhood, I was basically one of 7 kids, and this gradually, through time, the kids started appearing. And at the age of 10, and by this time, I had already forged some quite healthy, strong friendships in my neighborhood. I was shipped off to boarding school. Now, aside from the great opportunity to get a super education, it actually led me to feel detached from my family, my immediate siblings, friends that I had strong bonds with. And when I returned back from the UK, which from boarding school, it was suggested that perhaps it would be a good idea for me to leave. That's a kind of a polite way of getting expelled. I was shipped back to Portugal. By 1984, the landscape in my local neighborhood had changed drastically. So from being young kids, we were all teenagers, hormones are running rife, and what was a very colorful childhood, lots of music, lots of dancing, lots of culture, ended up being more about gun crime, knife crime, and drugs. And this is kind of where the story really started. So finding it hard to fit back into life as it was, I sort of became a bit alienated and unable to operate the way that I did in my neighborhood in the past and actually maintain the friendships that I had. So the area became increasingly dangerous, and it became quite difficult for me growing up. There was always a fear of having stones thrown at me, having dogs set on me. Every day going to school was a mission. It was quite frightening. But it led me to discovering drugs at quite an early age. And at the age of 13/14, I can't really remember, I was introduced to crack cocaine. And this was a one-time event that I revisited again at the age of 30, which is where my addiction really took hold. So I've kind of given you the fast-track version of how I got into addiction.
Okay, so of course that the path that led you to addiction is unpleasant, so to speak. But tell us about the recovery story.
Okay, so basically, just to carry on from the addiction side, let's not just imagine that it's about crack. My addiction started by standing on the stool in front of the medicine cabinet, swigging out bottles of cough medicine. Smoking cigarettes age 7, drinking excessively in my teens through my 20s and into my 30s, lots of pot smoking in my teens as well, up until the age of about 30. Pretty much by the time I rediscovered crack at the age of 30, all the other drugs didn't really matter. And so the situation was me running a relatively large business in the interiors and architectural sector. So I was supplying hard surfaces, meaning stone, mosaic, ceramics, etc., to the interior and architectural world. And at the same time, I was hiding in my potting shed in the garden, which we used to call the sugar hut. It doesn't sound so funny anymore, but it did at the time. And yeah, things got really, really difficult, and things came to a head in 2014 when I really started to realize that I just couldn't carry on in the way that I was going. And there are many events that actually led to that, and I'll be happy to share those if you'd like.
Yeah, absolutely. You can share that. But what I'm also interested about is, of course, you launched Tabula Rasa. So if you could also, kind of expand to what you were saying earlier about, if you could also talk about Tabula Rasa, and did you face any challenges setting up Tabula Rasa, or would you say that your experience with recovery has become instrumental in you managing Tabula Rasa?
Dennis, absolutely. I set up Tabula Rasa because I have worn the T-shirt. I have suffered through the pains of addiction for many, many years. I've seen the devastation around me, the effect that it had on my family. And see, the setting up of Tabula Rasa didn't happen by chance. The journey then took me onto discovering and trying to find a way to recover, which led me to a high-end rehab in Thailand. Now, bear in mind, at the time, the people in my work had no idea that I was an addict. And this is quite important because there are a lot of people outside of what we generally would term as addicts. There are a lot of people that don't actually realize that they are addicts. And I'd like to talk about that language a little bit later on. But we don't actually realize it. We think we're fine. We've got families, we've got businesses, everything's okay, but it's really not okay. And we're functioning and malfunctioning at the same time. So basically, my recovery journey led me to discover ibogaine. Now, I didn't discover it myself. My wife actually heard about ibogaine on a TED Talk and also a Joe Rogan podcast. And having tried rehab, having tried hypnosis, there really wasn't much else that I could think of trying. And this seemed crazy enough to try it. So it led me to read a little bit about ibogaine. And within a week of knowing about ibogaine, I was in a clinic in Amsterdam with Sarah Glatt, who's an amazing woman. And she treated me for my crack cocaine addiction. And it was one of the most significant and incredible things that I ever did. So must be pointed out that ibogaine, and I'm sure you'll ask me about it in a moment, is not a cure, but it was the springboard and a stepping stone for change that allowed me to actually go on to start my recovery journey in earnest. Now, my recovery journey started well before that, but it was the most significant part of that journey. And that's why Tabula Rasa was born. Tabula Rasa was born because the journey I had gone through had many things missing to it. The rehab in Thailand had opened me up to trauma, to understand that I actually had deep-rooted trauma on the last week before I left. That was a pretty bad way to leave an institution without actually resolving or digging deeper to actually have a better understanding of those traumas. And then the ibogaine treatment that I had, it was amazing. It was full of love. It was full of compassion. I can't fault it, but set and setting were certainly missing. And the setup, the intention, getting prepared for treatment was missing. The actual ibogaine treatment itself was amazing. I'd do it again with this lady. She is amazing. But the safety aspect was missing. And one of the most important aspects of a treatment in recovery is what happens next when you actually leave the center or the treatment that you're embarking upon. So this is why Tabula Rasa Retreat was born, to actually fill in the gaps with the missing elements and improve upon the elements that I actually thought could do with improvements. And then, of course, all the lessons learned to help us integrate post-treatment at our center.
Alvaro, I just want to touch on with what you were alluding to earlier, because I could sense that you have a bit of you're a bit hesitant to use the term addict, if I sense it right. So perhaps you're probably thinking of, so some people would rather prefer to use the term people with addiction. If you could just explain to us about the terminology and what you should be using.
Okay, well, that's a good question. And yeah, when I left rehab, I was told that only a few of us would make it. And they were quite right, because I relapsed. And I was encouraged to do 90 meetings in 90 days in the 12-step program, Narcotics Anonymous. And what I found was that there was a lot of reference to addicts, to addiction, to powerlessness, especially when we are using, of course. And it became very confusing, because it was hard to see myself just as an addict. I used to get into a lot of trouble in the rooms, as we call them, when I used to stand up and say, hello, my name is Al, I am, most people would say I'm an addict or an alcoholic, and I would say I'm a human. Now, that wasn't out of jest or to joke with anyone or not to take it seriously. It's just that I felt that I was in addiction in the past, and that I was now choosing to take a recovery journey and to focus more on wellness. So to continue labeling myself as an addict is counterproductive, and it's just feeding that subconscious mind with negativity. And I do believe that going forward, that with what we are doing at Tabula Rasa and people associated with us, is that I hope, and the mission is to reinvent rehabs as we know them, and perhaps even eradicate using the word rehab with people that have suffered from previous substance misuse issues. So it's really about changing the language. And I do believe that by changing the language, more people will actually seek help, because they will finally be able to identify that it's not really about the addiction, it's about what's underlying and underneath the addiction. And again, we're referring back to addiction. Also, some other words that tend to also diminish the person are things like getting clean. Well, someone told me recently, well, we're not dirty. So what does clean actually mean? And again, it brings us back to words and terminology like we were in addiction, we are now in recovery. It's hard to actually say fully recovered, because recovery is an ongoing process, but I do believe that we can recover.
Absolutely. And you make it a good point there, Al, that, of course, language is tied in with stigma. And I think that's the very premise of those people who advocate for people first sort of language, people with addiction or people with autism, for example. And the argument here is that if you humanize the condition, it can actually help people who are living with mental health issues or struggling with mental health issues. But let's leave it there, Al. I just want to touch upon ibogaine, because you talk about the psychoactive substance earlier. You kind of gave us an overview. But what I'm interested to hear more from you is, so what are the benefits and what are the side effects of ibogaine in comparison with other psychoactive substances?
Okay, well, just to help us out a little bit here in terms of what ibogaine is. So ibogaine is an alkaloid that is extracted from the Tabernanthe iboga shrub, which is endemic or indigenous to West Central Africa, namely Gabon, Cameroon, and parts of the Congo Basin. It's used actually by the Bwiti people for a rite of passage. So effectively, teenagers that are moving into adulthood will go through this rite of passage to draw a line in the sand and actually help them move forward their life and actually leave the past behind. This amazing alkaloid is even sometimes considered to be a sentient being, to have its own spirit. And it helps people by instilling wisdom inside of them, self-actualization, healing. And it does this through the visionary experience. Ibogaine, the alkaloid, is known as onerogen or onerophrenic substance, which puts you into a dream-like state, very much like REM sleep. Now, compared to other psychoactive substances, we can look at, we can name them: ayahuasca, psilocybin, also known as magic mushrooms. DMT is also pretty much being used now, MDMA and other substances. Ibogaine is very different because its mechanism of action is affecting the brain, the physical body, the spiritual, and the emotional body. So at a deeper level, Ibogaine works on the spirit. It will also help people unearth long forgotten memories, many memories that have been pushed down into the depths, memories that we have forgotten that still remain in our subconscious but are no longer in our consciousness. And often these memories will be associated with post-traumatic stress from abuse, from war, from simple traumas to very, very complex traumas that lead people to have poor mental health. Bear in mind, not everybody with poor mental health goes into addiction. Another interesting fact about Ibogaine is that it is super effective at detoxing people off short-acting opiates. So short-acting opiates such as heroin and morphine, for example. Prescription opiates like Suboxone, Subutex, etc., OxyContin, they're a little bit harder to detox. But for heroin, there is nothing like it on the planet that can detox a patient so rapidly and with close to little, if any, withdrawals. Now, I say close to, if any, because some people will suffer from more withdrawals than others, but there is nothing on the planet that is as effective as Ibogaine with the amelioration of withdrawals to opiates. And that is an incredible find. And that was discovered by a guy in 1962, 1963 called Howard Lotsof, who actually discovered that from ingesting Ibogaine, that about 36 hours later, he had no desire or physical withdrawals from heroin. And that was how this already started. Again, if we compare it to other entheogenic substances or psychedelics, Ibogaine also does have its dangers. It is probably the most dangerous out of the medicines I mentioned earlier. Ibogaine can be cardiotoxic, meaning it can affect the heart. It can increase the heart rate as well as decrease the heart rate. It can also send people into cardiac arrest and seizures. So it's incredibly important that people are well vetted before treatment. And I cannot stress this enough. Ibogaine is not a do-it-yourself-at-home medicine. It really is a big deal. It's dangerous, and people need to be vetted carefully and prepped properly for treatment.
Now that leads me to my next question about the key members, because you just said that Ibogaine, as you described, it's a very complex substance. So what sort of training does your key members have to deliver this to your clients, and how are the clients medically monitored?
Sure. Okay, that's a very good question, Dennis. So when we first started Tabula Rasa, we actually worked backwards. So we started to work from what does it look like when the client leaves, what does the treatment look like, and what does it look like before they come in. So if we just start at the beginning, so clients have to undertake full screening, so they have to undertake full blood tests, and they also need to undertake a 12-lead resting EKG, as well as a exercise stress test. So they're running on a treadmill so that we can see what the heart looks like under stress. They also have to fill in questionnaires. They also have to have a Skype call or several Skype calls to actually understand where they're at and to talk about contraindications, other medications, etc. So that's one area that's incredibly important. And it's unfortunate, but our job is to kind of give more no's than yeses, because as much as we want to help everybody, not everybody is suitable for this type of treatment. So the staff that I have in relation to the actual ibogaine treatment itself, we have a consulting doctor. In fact, there are a few consulting doctors. We also have our head nurse and provider, who is ex-NHS. He used to work in the cardiothoracic intensive care section in the NHS. He's the guy you want around when things go wrong, and things can go wrong. And we have seen things go wrong. So this is a man we want on our side, and he is extremely able to deal with an adverse event. We also have other nurses that are well qualified. They're qualified nurses, and they are also ACLS trained, so advanced life saving. And they're trained in that, and they also have a lot of experience as they have run many, many, many treatments with us. And then we have the auxiliary team as well, which also helps us with manpower, as clients are monitored throughout the first 48 hours, if not longer, from when the treatment starts. So I'll just give you a little idea of how it works. So people come in on a Monday. They are stabilized if they need it, in terms of they're stabilized on morphine. And this is in particular for people on opiates. People are made comfortable. We give them orientation, and we set intentions. And this is a very important part of the treatment, setting intention. Then in the morning, about 6:30 a.m., we put them on our heart monitor. The heart monitor shows us what their baseline looks like, so that when we give them the ibogaine, which is in a capsule form, it's a powder in a capsule, we give them a test dose to check if there are any adverse reactions. So they take the test dose, as well as magnesium and potassium, which support the heart. And then after about 35, 45 minutes, they should start feeling some little effects of the medicine, and then we put them back on the heart monitor. And it is at this stage when we start comparing what their baseline looked like compared to where they are at now, i.e. what sort of changes. And that determines how we go about our dosing regimen with what we call the flood dosing part of the treatment, which is when we give the larger doses, okay? So that's basically what happens. And then the clients are on the heart monitor throughout the next couple of days, and we are measuring their vital signs every hour. We're making sure they're safe. We're helping them get to the bathroom. Why do we help them get to the bathroom? Because they become ataxic. Ataxic is a side effect of the medicine, which means that you're finding it hard to walk. Your limbs aren't working particularly well. People also get nauseous, so they may vomit, and it's all part of the treatment, really. So we're there on hand to help them. So throughout the treatment, they're completely being looked after, observed, and monitored until they are back to baseline.
And of course, those you're just specializing in ibogaine, but I would imagine you also have a host of treatments that you offer to your clients. So can you talk us a little more about the other approach, the other treatments that you have available on Tabula Rasa Retreat?
Sure, absolutely. So, like I said, we were very focused when we started our project to focus less on the ibogaine and fill in around it. So we basically set people up for treatment. So this is what we call our pre-care. So we have numerous consultations with our expert counseling staff with the clients to understand where they're at, what their aspirations may be, perhaps what their purpose in life might be. We want to help them basically build the foundation so that when they leave and have already had their experience, they've already got a foot in the door so they can start building their house again. So that's incredibly important. When people come to us after the orientation, we work very, very hard on the intention settings. We really try to fine tune it so that it's not really just on a whim. It's very, very directed so that they're really strong with their intention. And then when they come out the other side, I'm sure you're going to ask me how the treatment feels and what happens during it. But after the actual ibogaine treatment, we use many techniques such as body work. So we're actually using massage and body work to remove traumas from the tissues, the body's tissues. They store trauma. We do breath work before treatment as well and after treatment, again, to stir up the emotional body so that the trapped emotions can start rising up so that there's a better possibility of those traumas being looked at and allowed to let go of. So it's super important to get the body stirring. We also introduce people to Kundalini yoga. Yoga is an amazing tool, especially Kundalini yoga. It was introduced to us by a guy called Tommy Rosen, who owns a company called Recovery 2.0. And Kundalini yoga is an exceptional tool to help people through their recovery processes. It builds resilience, stamina, continuity, patience. It's a wonderful, wonderful tool. We also put people into a sweat lodge. This is particularly good for helping people when they're detoxing off alcohol, off opiates and other drugs. It's coming out through the sweat, through the pores, and it's also a resilience exercise. We also use other indigenous plant medicines such as rapé, which is indigenous snuff, and also sananga, which are some very special eye drops, which it's a rather painful experience, but builds trust between the patient and client, or friends as we like to call them, and ourselves before and after treatment. And we also are big fans of cold therapy. It's all the rage now. Wim Hof, people like Troy Casey use it. And we're big fans of breath work and cold therapy. And we find that many clients take the tools that we teach them at our center and adopt them when they leave. So this is great. We are giving people the power to actually work on the recovery themselves with the tools that we provide them with.
Now, Al, you gave us a very good understanding of how Tabula Rasa operates and the kind of approach that your clients can expect at your treatment center. But I just want to turn our attention back to addiction, because I remember earlier that you mentioned that poor mental health is not just, there are many causes of addiction. So would you like to explore, whether based from your experience or based from professional knowledge, what causes addiction, and more importantly, with the people that you're helping, how can they avoid the relapse?
Okay, great question. Now, we really can answer this best by actually quoting some wonderful people in the field of addiction. Again, that word again. We will learn slowly how to get away from it, me included. Now, Gabor Mate actually says, It's not why the addiction, it's why the pain. Now, nearly everybody who comes through our center often comes in with a dual diagnosis. That dual diagnosis will include depression, often caused by post-traumatic stress disorders, which eventually led to the substance misuse. And also, let's not forget, addiction is not just substance misuse, it actually can be behavioral issues as well. Gambling, sex, now gaming, incessant scrolling on your telephone screens. It's all about unplugging. We're plugged in, but we're actually plugging out. And the other factor that seems prevalent is the lack of connection, is disconnection. We humans, it is natural. Our natural way is to connect and to communicate with others. And when we start losing that connection, which really happened with me when I came back to my neighborhood age 13, 14, I was finding it very difficult to connect back to what I had before. The world around us is forever changing, and we need to change with it. And my findings are that most people that suffer from mental health and substance misuse issues do have deep-rooted pain. Often it's actually to do with trauma. I don't think I have spoken to anybody that's been through my center that hasn't had some trauma of some kind. Now, we mustn't just think of trauma as what we call big T trauma. We're talking of war, rape, physical abuse. There are also other types of trauma. It can be something that might seem insignificant, like being told off by a teacher in class and made to feel super small and embarrassed and less than in front of other people. Maybe not matching up to the expectations of family. Those issues can be traumatic, and one person's trauma and the effect of that trauma might differ significantly to someone else's type of trauma. So it's really how we take this on and how we process it. And we are not all good at processing our emotions. And this is an area that is not taught at school. And I believe that this is a topic that really needs to be taught to kids so that they understand what trauma means and how they can use coping mechanisms to actually not go down the rabbit hole.
Absolutely. I think one of the lapses of the education system is that we seem to be investing more on intelligence quotient rather than emotional quotient, as you've emphasized earlier, that we seem to be, producing young people who are not well equipped to manage their emotion. But Al, we were talking earlier about the approach of Tabula Rasa, but I was just wondering, why is there a need to have a more holistic approach rather than the more traditional approach? Why is that?
Okay, so having been through the traditional system, again, like I mentioned earlier, there are many elements of the traditional system that are good, but they are becoming antiquated. And the thing is, it's mostly based around the disease model, especially when we come to talking about addiction. It's based on the disease model that it should be treated like a disease. But really, it's actually a dis-ease problem. And we're dealing with the after effects of this dis-ease rather than going to the root cause of our dis-ease. And that is the major problem, where we're dealing with things after the event. And again, like you mentioned about the education system, people aren't being educated that if you are feeling dis-eased and you are feeling disconnected and you are feeling that you are not being heard and people are not emotionally available for you, you are going to have that dis-ease around you. And that's where the focus needs to go. It's not really about doing what the traditional therapies do, which is mainly medicate the people that come into rehabs. You will give them alternative medications to help them basically taper off meds that they might be using. But I find that people are actually getting medicated in rehab and carrying on with medications when they leave rehab. For example, to SSRIs to help them with their depression, and people are getting addicted to benzodiazepines because of their anxiety and so on. So it's really about teaching people from a holistic point of view. And I don't actually spell holistic with an H. I put a W in front of the H. It's holistic, meaning that we've got to treat the body, the mind, the spirit, and the soul. And this is what is super important. Now, we can talk. Traditional therapy also has its place, but people are coming to me who have been to countless traditional rehabs, names of which will go unmentioned, and they have tried talk therapy, which is the prescribed therapy for most people that have mental health issues and addiction problems. And really, products like ibogaine and other entheogenic substances or psychedelics are cutting through the crap. People are bored of talking. They want to go right into the essence of the problem. They want to dig deep into their subconsciousness. And you can only do that with these medicines that, in most cases, are God's gifts. And coupled with these medicines, if we can use holistic processes and treatments like the ones I mentioned earlier, which are actually tools that people can practice, and also bolt on psychotherapy. There's nothing wrong with psychotherapy and CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. Also EFT, fantastic tool as well, where you're tapping on your pressure points. They help relieve trauma. There are so many techniques out there that are simply not being shared, and it's much easier for a doctor to prescribe a medication for a problem. And this is the beauty of the work we do. We are going straight to the problem, and then we're dealing with the problem head on.
Absolutely. Now, for the benefit of anyone watching this, if they want to explore more about your approach towards recovery, I'll drop the link on the description notes so everyone can visit your website directly. I just want to touch upon some people that you mentioned earlier, or one person that you mentioned earlier. You mentioned that you draw inspiration from Dr. Gabor Mate, and I understand, Matai rather. But I understand there's also another person that you draw inspiration from. It's Bob Cisco. So if you could just introduce Bob to us, and why did he inspire you, and what was your relationship with him?
Sure. Well, thank you for bringing that up, because Bob Cisco was a lovely man who recently passed away. It's very tragic. And he was my mentor at the start of this, the Tabula Rasa project. And in probably about 2016, 2017, I got an email out of the blue from this guy saying, hey, I've got ibogaine, do you want to buy it, blah, blah, blah. And we got talking, and I, with his guidance, created a PowerPoint presentation, and I went to sit with top government people in Portugal that are responsible for the decriminalization of drugs in Portugal. And I introduced ibogaine to them as a great tool to help alleviate the addiction problem in Portugal and all the associated problems with it, which is high levels of Hep C, HIV, crime, all sorts of problems associated with it. So it's not just, it's a social problem and an economical problem, and the problems ripple through society. And they were very kind to me, and they listened intently. But what they told me was, great, love it, you need to do clinical trials. So Bob Cisco was one of the forefathers of the ibogaine movement, which really started in the 60s with Howard Lotsoff, who's the guy who discovered ibogaine as an addiction interrupter, as well as Bob Cisco, Norma Lotsoff, Boaz Watchell, there's a Dr. Bastians in Holland, so many inspiring people. And Bob basically started teaching me from the ground up how to approach ibogaine treatments, how to focus heavily on safety, and also how to build a clinical trial. And so he coached me throughout that process. As he called it, you got to get all your ducks in a row. And this is what I've been doing since his lessons and his mentoring. We always plan to get all our ducks in a row and be prepared. And one thing that we do very differently at Tabula Rasa is that we collect data from every single client that comes through our doors, with their permission, of course. And all this data is actually anonymous. And we are gradually collecting enough data to be able to prove the safety and efficacy of ibogaine treatment in the betterment of mental health problems and addiction problems. So this is what Bob helped instill in me, and I am forever grateful to this day. May he rest in peace, dear Bob.
Absolutely, and thank you for sharing your your relationship with Bob. And it's really important that that we highlight people who have influence how we approach how we approach the things that we do. Now, Al, how do you see ibogaine treatment influencing the the recovery field, the treatment landscape?
Right, ibogaine is a little bit like the black sheep of the plant medicine world, let's call it that, because of the safety issues. It is not very high up on the agenda. If you can imagine a pharmaceutical company that's dishing out OxyContin, and then you've got clients that are basically hitting the prescription counter on a weekly basis to pick up their medicines, or people doing methadone, or other long-acting opiates, for example, and then they can do ibogaine once and actually have very little withdrawal symptoms and actually not need those opiates again. That is a big deal. It's going to come up against a big roadblock. So there are organizations like MAPS, which are run by Rick Doblin, who I believe that ibogaine is probably next on his agenda. He's just getting MDMA through to various phases in his clinical trials to hopefully become a prescription medicine in the future. They're testing it out on people with PTSD, war veterans, and people with mental health issues. So there's a long road ahead. My dream is that ibogaine is available to everybody on the national health systems around the world, and that it's administered safely, and so that people can't just, well, that there isn't just the ability to get ibogaine in high-end clinics or hotels around the world, where people can actually go to their national health service and get well. That's the dream, that people can also get it on their insurances, their health insurances. It's probably a bit of a pipe dream at the moment, but we do this work because we believe in it, and we're going to keep flying the ibogaine flag until people start listening.
Yeah, definitely, and it's really important to get the word out about ibogaine. And thank you for choosing DRH show as one of the vehicle to share about ibogaine. Now, we've been talking about ibogaine addiction and recovery for nearly 40 minutes now, but
Wow.
I'd like to wrap this up with some quick fire questions, just to finish on a lighter note and just to get to know you more as a person. So the first thing that I want to hear from you is, what were you afraid of as a child?
I was afraid of being alone.
And what is your favorite word in another language?
Foda-se.
Which
It's a bit
means?
rude. It's a bit rude in Portuguese, but it's It's the F word. It's very
Oh,
universal.
I like it. It's a very intense language. I think it captures all of the emotions, whether we're happy or whether we're angry. We're angry. So I could, I could sense why you love that word. But if you weren't the founder of Tabula Rasa, what would you have pursued in your life?
I would have become a rock star. And I worked very hard at trying to do that, but the constraints of family and the expectations led me to get into work and not follow my dream. And my message to anyone is follow your dreams, or you're going to end up on the end of a substance you really don't want to be using.
Absolutely. And Al, finally, the floor is all yours. Tell us what else is in the pipeline, if you have any upcoming project in relation to Tabula Rasa, or maybe you have a book project. And if people wanted to reach out to you, what platforms can they get in touch with you at?
Okay, well, first of all, Dennis, thank you so much for having me on your platform. I have to say it was rather nerve-wracking to be doing this for the first time, but I really do appreciate it, and thank you for your patience with me. People could find us on at tabularasa-retreat.com online. They can find us through YouTube, through Instagram. We're pretty much near the top parts of Google if you're looking for ibogaine treatment in Europe, UK, Portugal, and beyond. What have we got in the pipeline? Well, I've got a new clinic that I've recently opened up in Mexico, in the Rosarito area, just across the border from San Diego, to service our American clientele predominantly. And we are in quite serious talks about how to modernize the Southeast Asian rehabs, which were incredibly successful over the last 10 years, which suffered tremendously during the COVID pandemic. But there is an opportunity that's presenting itself to actually introduce ibogaine and other entheogenic substances for the betterment of mental health and to treat addiction. So this is what I'm talking about. It's the Rehabs 2.0 with a language change. This is happening. I don't have a timeline for it, but we're in serious talks. We really need to make a big difference and a dent in this pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, those are exciting developments, Al. Alvaro de Ferranti, founder of Tabula Rasa Retreat. It's great to have you here in the DRH show, and I look forward to hearing more about your work. Thank you.
Dennis, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.